rolling. So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining in on the Environmental Quality Board meeting this afternoon. I am Nancy Daubenberger with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I'm the commissioner and I am your new EQB chair. Very honored to be asked by Governor Walz, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan to step into this role and address you today as the chair for EQB. And I'm looking forward very much to the work we have ahead of us to work together with you on it. And before we begin today, I do want to mention that the December meeting date has changed. So we had that out on December 21st, but just recognizing how close that was to the holidays, we thought we better bump that up. So hopefully the adjusted date of December 14th from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock p.m. does work for you all. So thank you for understanding about that change. And at this point, I will turn it to our Interim Executive Director, Erik Dahl, who will now call the roll.
Right. Thank you, Chair Daubenberger. Welcome. I'm Erik Cedarleaf Dahl. I'm the Interim Executive Director, and I'm going to walk through the roll since we have both virtual attendees and attendees. So Grace Arnold, Commissioner Grace Arnold, thank you. Next, we have Board Member Peter Bakken.
Here, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Joseph Bauerkemper. The chair is here. Board Member Julie Gehring. Right. Commissioner Steve Grove. Marked as tentative. Board Member Riley Hintz. Right.
Erik, this is Nancy. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't hear anything either.
Okay.
It says they're muted. They're muted on the screen. The room's muted.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said something, Nancy, because I was just wondering if I lost all my audio or just the room.
I was wondering too.
This is Peter. I was wondering the same thing.
Thank you. I messaged Marty to see.
I just got a text from Erik saying We are having a computer crash. Oh no. And they are going to reboot. So everybody online, please just hold on.
Standing by.
Thank you. All right, I got another message from Erik that the computer crashed again and asked that we check back in 5 minutes. So maybe those of us online should jump off and jump back on at 10:50, excuse me, at 1:15. Thanks.
Chair Dobbenberg, can you hear me? Oh, she might have just gotten back off. Chair Dobbenberger, can you hear me? This is Erik Dahl.
She may have jumped off, but Erik, this is Sarah. I can hear you now.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Stroman. We're just having folks jump back on. We'll start the meeting shortly once hopefully the computer is stable. Commissioner Daubenberger, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, you're
Can you
very
hear me?
quiet, so let's see if we turn up the room volume. Commissioner Daubenberger, can we try your audio again?
Certainly. Testing, testing.
We can hear you. Great, thanks.
Good.
So I'll continue the roll call here. See. We already have a quorum. I'll go back to Assistant Commissioner Kevin McKinnon. Assistant Commissioner Dan Huff. You may have dropped off. Commissioner Sarah Stroman.
I am here.
And we see you. Thank you. Commissioner Peterson.
I'm here.
All right. Thank you. All right, Madam Chair, we have a quorum and we'll probably get some more folks to join and we'll let you know as they join. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for getting us through the technology challenges we had there. Hopefully that'll be it for the rest of the meeting. And I wanted to mention too, really sorry I'm not joining you all in person. I'm out in DC this week for a meeting, so tuning in this way, but really do plan to make as many of these in person as I possibly can. So with that, though, we will go ahead and move on, especially since we have a quorum, we can move to the approval of the consent agenda. So that would be first approval of the meeting minutes from May 18th of 2022. And then the preliminary agenda for today's meeting, the meeting of September 21st, 22 of the EQB. So is there a motion to approve? First of all, Eric, do we approve these separately? I think is that how that goes?
Chair Daubenberger, they can be approved together just as the consent agenda.
Great. We'll approve those. We'll look for motions to approve those together as one consent agenda item. Can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll make that motion. This is Mehmet Koner-Steenberg.
Thank you, Member Koner-Steenberg. Do we have a second?
We have a second in the room, Commissioner Daubenberger. Julie
Great.
Gehring.
Thank you, Julie. All right. Any discussion? I'm not hearing any, but let me just check with the room. Eric, any discussion there in the room?
No, Chair Daubenberger.
Okay, all in favor, go ahead and say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. I'm not hearing any opposition. Anything in the room there, Eric?
No, Chair Daubenberger.
Great. Then the motion carries and the consent agenda is adopted. Right. So now I will turn it over to our Interim Executive Director, Erik Cedarleaf, for the Executive Director's report.
All right. Thank you, Chair Daubenberger. I have quite a few announcements, so I'll move through them quickly with some of our technical delays. I wanted to introduce a new EQB staff member today, Kayla Walsh. She's in the room. Kayla joins us from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, where she spent 6 years leading policy development and education campaigns related to waste prevention, reuse, and recycling. Kayla led statewide organics program and recycling education program for the solid waste division at Pollution Control. She has experience in measuring and communicating the climate impacts of Minnesotans' consumption and waste. And Kayla has a background in environmental communications which she is excited to apply here at her new role at EQB. And we're really excited and happy to have Kayla join us. Today is her first day. Thanks, Kayla. I wanted to let folks know about Congressional District 7. The CD7 application process is still open. We've had some recent interest in the CD7 applications with some new applicants, but if anyone you'd like to recommend is out there, please have them apply through the Secretary of State website. And if you need that link, I can share that with you. I wanted to give the board an update on the Environment and Energy Report Card as well. Due to current staffing capacity, data, and timing of the 2023 Environmental Congress, we're currently going to postpone releasing the Environment and Energy Report Card in December 2022, and we expect to release it in conjunction with the 2023 Environmental Congress. And we can talk more about that in our future MEPA discussion at the end of today's meeting. I wanted to also give the board an update on the pilot program and the ERIS update. The SPPI meeting was held in August, and EQB staff presented preliminary data on the pilot program and discussed the pilot program design and implementation effectiveness with the SPPI subcommittee. A pollinator update, the IPPT is working on a 2022 pollinator annual report and the pollinator action framework. During the November meeting, the team will bring the report for approval and the action framework draft to the board for discussion and feedback. So you'll hear about that in November. And then I wanted to let you know that the EQB is going to be holding an open comment period on an obsolete rules report. Annually, EQB staff review Minnesota Rules 4410 and report to the legislature about rules that are obsolete, unnecessary, and duplicative of other federal or state statutes or rules. EQB is holding a 30-day comment period from September 27th to October 27th and asking for feedback to help identify the obsolete, unnecessary, and duplicative rules, explain a need for change, and provide suggestions to resolve the identified rules. A short survey will be available to provide feedback, and that'll be on our website. And then I just wanted to let everybody know some logistics for today, since we are hybrid meeting, and we're going to be using microphones today so that everyone online can hear us and then we can be heard in the recording. So we're going to have this microphone right here that we'll pass around, and we have an EQB staff member that can help pass it around. But if you have something to say in the room, please raise your hand and then wait till you get the microphone to speak. For those online, if you have something, have a comment or would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And if we look here, this is the public comment procedures and guidelines, but also for board members, if you would like to raise your hand in WebEx, then we can see that you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. We also would like to emphasize we hope to have a good discussion today. We have the MEPA discussion at the end, and we have a lot to cover with the water plan and climate updates. And we hope we have a good discussion today, and we're looking for some good feedback from the board. When you speak, please state your name each time you speak. This ensures that people joining remotely can more easily follow the conversation. And for those of you online, please keep your camera on as much as possible. We know there may be a time where you need to have your camera off, but keeping it on as much as possible helps us all stay connected and have meaningful and productive conversation. There will be a public comment period at the end of the board meeting, and these are the guidelines that are similar for board members to raise your hand online, or if there's a member of the public in person, they can submit a written comment. We have comment sheets out there. And you can raise your hand in WebEx or type your name in the WebEx chat, and then we'll put together a list and have that option. Here's how you do that on the WebEx application. And so with that, Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you for those updates, Director Dahl. And now I'll introduce our next agenda item, and that's going to be an update on climate change and water in Minnesota from Dr. Kenneth Blumenfeld from the DNR.
Thank you, Madam Chair Daubenberger. Greetings to board members and commissioners. present and attending virtually. My name is Kenny Blumenfeld. I'm a climatologist with the State Climatology Office, and I'll be talking to you today about what's going on with our climate here in Minnesota. So this is going to be a somewhat condensed overview of the changes that we have observed here in Minnesota, and it will also give us at least a chance to look into the future using some of the state of the science climate projections. So as we talk about climate and how the climate is changing, the points, if you can see them on the screen, these are always good to bear in mind. First is that geography really matters. Our climate here in Minnesota is different from the climate of, say, California or Maine, and certainly of other parts of the world. And it should not surprise us then that the way that our climate has changed is different from those places too. There's a lot of similarities in many respects, and in other respects, there are some differences. And this is important because not everybody is up to date on the data and the science that is specific to Minnesota, and you might be getting information about how the climate is changing from a national or even international news source, and that might not spell out for you what's actually happening here in Minnesota. So we like to point out that Minnesota has its own story. Another important consideration is that we're still learning about how trends, and you can think of that as persistent changes in some variable within the climate, or you might think of it as predominant tendencies, how these trends and variability, which is the kind of normal ups and downs that we've always had and probably always will have, how these work together. We're still learning about that. All we know is that both are ongoing simultaneously. In other words, we have some ongoing changes in our climate, and we also still have the normal ups and downs. And these can team up to do some really interesting things that we'll talk about. Third point is that when we look at climate projections, so we're looking at the future, that information need not conform with the observations from the past. In many cases, they will. But in some cases, we may be seeing types of changes in the future that have not yet arrived and that we have not yet experienced. The fourth and fifth points kind of go hand in hand. One is that we have to accept that there are nuances. This is not an easy subject, even for the scientists. We're always learning more information. My colleagues and I, one of my colleagues is on the panel later this afternoon, Luigi Romolo, the state climatologist. We all talk about the difficulty and the complexities that are associated with not just climate, but also the changing climate. And then the fifth piece is that we also have to expect surprises. Climate's not always going to follow the bullet points that you see in a presentation like this one. There are going to be finer points that we can't always detail, especially in a short presentation. So here's what we've observed, and it's kind of a snapshot of what we've observed and a little bit of information on what's projected. Minnesota has become warmer and wetter in general. There was actually a major shift that appears to have occurred sometime around 1970, and it's especially taken off in the last few decades. Warmer conditions, wetter conditions. Now remember, our climate still has ups and downs, that normal variability. So we're not talking about every year being warmer or wetter than the year before. It's just been this shift, this dominant tendency for climate conditions to produce warmer and wetter conditions than what we had experienced as normal historically. This has left us with shorter and often warmer winters with oddly more snowfall than we would have had historically, but also less snow cover because our winters are so much warmer. We've seen a rapid loss in cold weather extremes. Minnesota still gets very cold, but not the way that it used to and not with the frequency that it used to. These two changes that I've summarized so far, getting warmer and wetter in general and having shorter, less severe winters, these are projected as almost guaranteed to continue. Very few, in terms of the conditions getting warmer, every model that we've seen for the last 2 generations of climate models shows Minnesota continuing to warm. and the majority of models show us having at least more extreme precipitation. In the summertime, we've had fewer cool nights and more frequent and heavier downpours. That's what we have observed so far. We've had more frequent and sometimes larger extreme events. These are also projected to continue. And although Minnesota has not yet observed an increase in the frequency or severity of heat waves, that might feel counterintuitive because we all swear that it's been getting hotter, but in Minnesota, not so much, maybe in far northern parts of the state. But the same climate projection models are basically unanimous that extremes of heat will arrive within the next couple or few decades. And we don't know exactly when. It could be sooner than that, but sometime by 2040, 2050, we do expect more frequent, more extreme heat waves. And we can just look around the country and world and see evidence of that already. So here's a snapshot of how temperatures have changed nationally since the turn of the 20th century. Hopefully you can find Minnesota there where that we're in the upper middle part of each of those maps. We're that state that looks like someone took a bite out of it on the right side. And you can see that all these maps are 30-year averages, what we call normals, relative to the 20th century averages. And you see that we were much cooler than 20th century averages in the upper left or at the beginning and the early kind of middle part of the 20th century. And as we progress towards that lower right map, just gotten warmer and warmer. And you can see the second to last map shows that Minnesota at that time, so right through 2010, we were essentially the fastest warming state in the US. You can see in the most recent set of climate normals that much of the other parts of the country have caught up, but we're still, essentially experiencing the warmest period that we've recorded. If you want to see a kind of a zoomed in view of what our warming is shaped like in Minnesota, our total warming since 1895 has averaged about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. It's been faster in northern Minnesota, so this is the left map, and it's been a little bit slower in southern Minnesota, but it's been warming across, on average across the year over the long term. If you look at the middle map, that shows where a lot of our warming has really been concentrated. Wintertime nights. A typical winter night, that would be December, January, and February in northern Minnesota, is now over 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. It's not quite as dramatic in southern Minnesota, but it is still dramatic. And if you look over on the right, that's the summertime high temperatures. So a typical summertime day is now showing some warming over central and especially northern Minnesota, but it's not nearly as extreme as the warming that we're seeing in winter nights. And you do see that southern Minnesota actually shows some long-term cooling of summertime days. And this is a phenomenon that's been observed throughout the Midwest. And again, the models indicate that it's somewhat temporary and that by the time we get a couple or a few decades ahead, it will have reversed, if not sooner. The average January night in International Falls, just since the middle of the 20th century, is now about 9, even more than 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was. So in about 7 decades, we've seen dramatic warming of the coldest month of the year in what is one of the coldest major weather stations in the United States. Our growing season has been expanding and our frost or freeze seasons have been shortening. This is one of our best stations. It's out in Milan in western Minnesota. It's 3 generations of the same family making observations at the same location. And what we see, on average is that the frost-free season in Minnesota is expanding by 2 to 3 weeks. In other words, that frost or freeze season itself is shortening by 2 to 3 weeks. It's coming about a week or so later in the fall, and that final frost of spring is coming earlier in the spring. So you get your last freeze of the season a little bit earlier on average. You can also see, if you look at each of the individual graphs, plenty of variations along the way to those trends. So it doesn't mean that every year you're going to have a longer growing season or a shorter freeze season. our friends at the Pollution Control Agency released this nice tool that shows what's happened to ice cover on Minnesota lakes. And this is some of the data that our office helped provide, showing on average, 10 to 15 day shortening of the ice cover season. There's all kinds of year-to-year variation in there. And some lakes showing more than other lakes, some regions showing more than other. But on average, we're seeing 10 to 15 days of ice cover loss. Typical season now, therefore, having 1 to 2 weeks less ice on a Minnesota lake than 50 years ago. Now, meanwhile, even with a very hot 2021, and we could even add 2022 into this, and we're back out at Milan in western Minnesota looking at the hottest days of the year, we don't really yet see any indication that these types of conditions are outside of historical ranges. Hot weather is not yet in a historically unusual position. However, when we look at numerical climate models that project conditions into the future, even the rosiest, this is one of the rosiest, one of the most optimistic climate models that's been run in the last 2 generations. It was it basically suggested that all the countries get their emissions under control relatively quickly, and we start stabilizing. And even with that, because of all the extra carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are already committed to and in the atmosphere, even in that situation, by 2050, 2060 or so, typical place in Minnesota would have 2 to 3 times the number of 90-degree days that they currently experience. So in southern Minnesota, you're talking about 10 to 15, maybe even 20 additional days where the temperature reaches or exceeds 90 degrees, and that's over what's normal. So we will expect more extremes of heat and more heat waves. That's just seems to be all but guaranteed at this point. When we look at precipitation, our annual precipitation, the graph on the left, really also began picking up in the last few decades, especially since 1970 or so. You see annual variation in there is pretty high, but there has been this increase in wetness to the tune, and this is on average around Minnesota, of about a little over 0.4 of an inch per decade. So a typical place in Minnesota has added 2 to 2.5 inches of precipitation in the last 5 decades alone. Some parts, especially in southern Minnesota, even more so. When we look at the graph on the right, that's taking our long-term historical stations, and we're just looking at the largest daily rainfall from these stations. And what you see is a tendency, it's not every single year, but a tendency towards larger values, especially more recently. So it's a trend towards more extreme events for precipitation here in Minnesota. And of course, the result, this is from Minnesota Public Radio. This is an image of Duluth prior to the 2012 flood, and this is during the 2012 flood. And the point isn't that this is happening everywhere, every year, but these types of scenes are becoming more common because we are getting more of these big precipitation events. And the climate models, same ones that show more 90-degree days, basically no matter what we do, also show a high likelihood of not just more precipitation, which is what we're seeing on the left. So continued increases in annual precipitation on the left. I'm sorry, that's on the right. And then on the left, it's continued increases in the magnitude of the heaviest rains, essentially, or additional days with what we call 98th percentile rainfall. Don't take the detail in these maps to literally blur your eyes and they give you the right picture. It's that the kind of rains that used to come every 1 to 2 days per year on average would now come every 2 to 3 days per year, and that's by the middle of the century. Or that the kinds of increases in annual precipitation we've already seen will basically be repeated again by the time we get to, say, 2040, 2050, 2060. Now, there's some nuance in here. I said we had to accept nuance, and that nuance, my colleague Luigi Romolo can speak to this in greater detail, but drought is definitely part of this story. We have on the left, that's an image of Minnehaha Falls, which all but ran out of water in 2021. and the drought monitor map for Minnesota from the kind of height of the 2021 drought. I just want to point out that one of the areas that was impacted greatest was up on the northern border of Minnesota, where we border into Canada, Ontario, and Manitoba, the International Falls area. Now, this is a map or a graph of International Falls' year-to-date precipitation. It's through 3 days ago, so through September 18th. And what I want to point you to is the lower right, the very lower right part. You see I've called it out. The driest year-to-date on record in International Falls was 2021. We only had 12 inches of rain, just over a foot of rain, which is way below normal. And this is for their consistent record, goes back to 1940. Now look, let's add the next year. Oh my goodness. The next year, this year, International Falls is experiencing its wettest year to date. So the normal ups and downs that we talked about can, in some cases, deliver us to drought. And then even while we're still recovering from drought and still feeling the effects of drought or renewed drought conditions in Minnesota, we've had other stations that have gone right back to the extraordinarily wet patterns that have dominated the last couple decades. International Falls is on its way to its wettest year on record. It might not break that record, but it would have to shift to a very dry regime for that. It's only about 4 inches away from its. And I also said we should expect surprises. Now, this is not from Minnesota. This is a graph from Portland, Oregon. And what we actually have is, it says it's the 50th high temperatures on record in Portland, Oregon, but it's actually the 45 highest temperatures on record in Portland. And it's organized over time. And you can see the reason I put these here is because these values go right through 2020. And they are very similar to what the highest temperatures on record would be for any given central or southern Minnesota town. But look at what happened in 2021. 3 different dates broke in sequence, broke those records. So the highest temperature on record in Portland, Oregon went from 107 degrees to 116 degrees in a matter of days. And these are the sorts of surprises that we have not yet had in Minnesota, and we cannot say when they will come, but they are happening with increasing frequency in a wider spread parts of the world. We saw it in England this year. We've seen it with rainfall. We've seen it with temperatures, and it would be foolish of us to not be positioned for these sorts of surprises. So to summarize all of this, and I thank everybody for the time, Minnesota is getting warm pretty quickly. We've had profound changes, especially during winter. Precipitation is also increasing. We've had more heavy rain, and we didn't even talk about heavy snow, but that's increasing just like rainfall is. There's more warming projected and also more precipitation projected, and that includes precipitation extremes and the eventuality, which is almost a certainty, that we're going to get into major heat extremes. We don't know when they'll begin. Sometime in the next couple or few decades is what most of the models agree on. And that future drought, when you factor in those normal ups and downs, now pair a kind of really dry season like maybe we had last year with the kinds of extremes of heat that we have not yet experienced, and you have to conclude that future drought, even if it's not all that common, could be significant once that increased heat kicks in. So thank you, everybody, for your time, and I will yield.
Thank you, Dr. Blumenfeld, for that information. And I was kind of wondering about the snowfall, where that's been at. It seems like we've had less snowfall, but maybe I'm not tracking on that, over the last several years. But I'll pause here, see if any of the board members have any questions for you.
This is Peter Bakken.
Go ahead, Peter.
I found it interesting, or was wondering if you had some explanation as I was looking at your models or the pictures that you had with the temperature differences, seeing that there was a greater difference in temperatures, increased temperatures in the northern third of the state, where there's what I would consider to be less disturbed ground. You've got trees, you've got less farming, you've got less livestock, things like that, that the temperature would be higher up there than southern Minnesota, where we've got soil disturbance, more livestock, those kinds of things. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, thank you for your question. And the explanation, I guess we should start with you can see these maps again, showing the warming kind of greater in northern Minnesota. Remember, we're only looking at Minnesota here. This pattern goes off the map right through Canada. Warming is generally greater especially in continental masses, with poleward extent. And this has to do with the same mechanism that is actually causing the globe to get warmer. You've heard about greenhouse gases and the effect that they have on global temperatures. Well, what they're really doing, and what most people don't realize, is they are absorbing heat that is stored when the sun shines and then starts to escape at night. And that heat also escapes during the winter time. And so there's the greatest opportunity to retain heat in the areas that have long nights and especially long winters. So the explanation for this sort of northward focus of the warming in Minnesota has less to do with land cover and more to do with just the physics of the shape of the earth and what that does to the length of our days, our nights, and our seasons. I hope that helps.
So in essence, that area is kind of storing that heat versus creating it.
Yes, as you go from the equator to the poles, you go from regions that essentially produce and distribute heat to regions that receive heat. So in northern Minnesota, certainly when the sun is shining and is bright during those relatively long summer days, there is a net storage of heat going on. But once the sun goes down, they start losing a lot of that heat. And that especially becomes true around this time of year, where our nights start getting a lot longer and as we head into winter. And that's why we see some of the strongest warming signals, not only in areas that have long winters, but also during winter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Joseph Bauerkemper in the room with a question for Dr. Blumenfeld.
Go ahead, Joseph.
All right, thank you, Chair. So thank you for the presentation, learning a lot. I'm wondering, I share with the Chair sort of wondering about snow, and I'm hoping you can say a brief bit about that in general. I have a particular question about that, and I'm wondering if you have some way, if precipitation is reckoned in such a way. I'm trying to think about warmth, and I would anticipate that an inch of snow has less water than an inch of rain, and so I'm trying to think about these big precipitation trends and whether we're talking about something quite different when we think about snow, an inch of snow or an inch of precipitation or an inch of rain. So if you could say a brief bit about that, that'd be helpful.
Very good. Thank you for your question, and I will do my best to answer. The first piece, just to address snowfall trends in general, is that for Minnesota, the snowiest period on record was truly the 1980s, and at some stations in 1990s. But there was a resurgence in the 2000s and especially the 2010s, where many stations in Minnesota experienced their snowiest decade on record. And almost all stations in Minnesota during that time experienced a higher frequency of heavy snow than any other period on record. Meaning, even if seasonal snowfall was higher at other times, there were more days where you were getting 4 or 6 or 8 inches of snow in the more recent decade. to the point that it seems like it hasn't been as snowy. I imagine that has to do with snow cover because we have been much warmer during winter and we've had more time to melt snow in between snowfall events. So the behavior of snow on the ground does not appear to have been as consistent as maybe what we were used to decades ago. And to the final point, it's a fair point, what about the difference between snow and rain in general? You make a good point. There is definitely much more water. On average, it would be 10 times more water in an inch of rain than an inch of snow. But the reaction that both these precipitation types are having to the changing climate could be summarized similarly. And it's basically this. And again, there's a lot of complexities and nuances here, and you could take entire graduate level courses in this. So please forgive that there's, a little bit of generalizing going on. But when the global temperatures rise, what happens, and this is basically etched into physical laws, that water will evaporate at a higher rate. Well, when water evaporates, it means that water goes from liquid into gas. The gas form of water is what we know as humidity. And the biggest source of water in the world is the oceans, right? And so as global temperatures rise, we evaporate water off of the oceans, leaving us with much richer stores of moisture or humidity for our passing weather systems, whether they're in the winter or the summer. So as a precipitating weather system comes to town, it's going to have a little bit more fuel to work with, and it's going to have the potential to produce more precipitation. It doesn't happen every time. It really, it's not like every time that it rains more than it used to. Every time it snows more than it used to. It's just that increase in the availability of moisture is starting to affect our climate statistics, and we're seeing it in all the seasons. And one of the curiosities and one of the things that we'll see when the next generation of climate models comes out and when the University of Minnesota finishes its computer model studies, is we'll see what's going to happen to the length of the snowfall season, because we expect it to contract. And if it contracts faster than the increases in occasional snowfall intensity can keep up with, then we would expect the snowfall statistics eventually to start falling off, even if we have, occasional extremes that we hadn't seen before. But we're not at the point where we can describe that with much precision just yet. I'll be eager to see what happens with the University of Minnesota study.
Thank you.
Thank you for that description, Dr. Blumenfeld. And I think we have time for one more question, and I see Dan Huff has his hand up. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and really appreciate this presentation. Thank you very much. First, a comment and then a question. One is, as an ice angler, I mourn the loss of our winter season and the quality of ice. But as a public health perspective, I'm very concerned about human impacts. We know that as we have hotter days, hotter nights, and more humid days, that we're going to see an impact on human health, and we are seeing that now. But I want to specifically, I have a question on the precipitation. We build our infrastructure to withstand or to certain design standards. So, for example, it is not inundated in a 100-year flood. A lot of our infrastructure is public health related, whether it be our hospitals, our roads, or our drinking water plants. Do we have, as we see more extremes in precipitation, do we have the sophistication in the data yet to calculate, what does a 100-year flood, which is based upon the probability factor, have we been able to determine how that has changed? The joke is, oh yeah, you have 500-year floods all the time now, and we're seeing more of those. Are we starting to be able to recalculate what a 100-year flood means? Thank you.
That is also an excellent question, and I will do my best to address it. So the 100-year or the 500-year storm or flood is probably one of the most poorly understood concepts in the public domain, because it's really, when we talk about a 100-year storm, we're talking about a storm that has that 1% probability of occurring in any given year at that place. And so if one town in southeast Minnesota gets a 100-year storm, then the next year a town in west central Minnesota gets a 100-year storm. There isn't really anything about that that violates the sort of statistical rules that govern these. But in any case, there have been updates to the publications that are used for referencing the 100-year or the 1% probability storm, these extreme events that drive the design or the precipitation design values that are kind of woven throughout our infrastructure. We do have some ability, using the climate records that are available to Minnesota and to other parts of the country, to estimate how some of these values have changed over time. However, the statistical and spatial techniques that are used to come up with these values are fairly sophisticated and not necessarily easy to replicate. And they're best done by these kind of large consortiums of scientists. Generally, this is in the domain of NOAA. The good news is, I think we are at a point where there's an increasing appetite for this type of information, and we are close. There are people in this room here who actually know more about maybe the progress towards getting new precipitation design values for Minnesota, but the climate models that are being generated and downscaled for the state of Minnesota at the University of Minnesota offer at least the potential to estimate some of those changes and make estimates of how the changes will be valid into the future, or how we'll see further changes into the future. But also the agency of responsibility for this, NOAA, and their Hydrologic Design Center, is actually very interested in revisiting the current values for the NOAA Atlas 14, which is the publication of record. And these values, optimistically, they could be renewed for Minnesota sometime this decade if all of the right things fall into place. So again, there's a lot of interest in this topic, and I might not be the most knowledgeable person even in this meeting to talk about the appetite for all of that information and some of the initiatives in place, but I know from my own experience that this is a very popular topic, and it's highly urgent because our infrastructure is susceptible to damages if we don't have the right values in place to anticipate extremes of precipitation. So I apologize for the long answer, but thank you for the good question.
That was a great answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question, Dan. I understand you need to jump off for an urgent meeting, but thank you, Dr. Blumenfeld, for all the information and all that you shared in regards to the questions that we asked too. So we will go ahead and move on with respect to the time on the agenda. And the next item on the agenda is we have Assistant Commissioner Craig McDonnel and Climate Director Frank Kohlasch, both from the MPCA, and they'll be giving us an update from the Climate Change Subcabinet on Minnesota's Climate Action Framework, which the Governor and Lieutenant Governor just rolled out at an event at the Ecolab last Friday. I was privileged to be a part of that. Very exciting. So I will go ahead now and turn it to Craig.
Thank you, Commissioner Daubenberger, and thank you, EQB members. I'm happy to be here. Could I just get verbal confirmation that my mic is working with all of the technical difficulties? Awesome.
I can hear you.
Thank you. And I think somebody's going to help me with some slides here. I haven't seen them up. There we go. So next slide, please. And just wanted to take a second and discuss why a climate action framework and why we began this work with the Subcabinet, which, as you may know, the Subcabinet is made up of 15 different boards and agencies, many of whom sit on the Environmental Quality Board. And so primarily, we heard from people across Minnesota that we needed a clear statement of what we want to accomplish together when it comes to climate action. And we recognize that there's great value in bringing together voices from across emission sectors and from all across the state to bring them together in one place to have this conversation and to discuss what are those bold visions that Minnesota needs as it relates to climate action and how we can have this conversation. In addition to that, the Climate Action Framework is an opportunity to provide a blueprint and to share our thinking and organize our thinking as both state agencies, as a subcabinet, and then as Minnesota even more broadly than that. And so one thing I want to emphasize when we talk about organizing and sharing our thinking is, though we released this document last Friday, this framework is not the end of our climate action. In fact, there's a lot to do, and in some ways, it's the beginning of our work here. And recognizing that it is a stepping stone for further action, we wanted this to be something that clearly catalyzes action across sectors, across government entities, across the private sector, and other actors as well. What we need is climate action. We all understand that. And we know that Minnesota, state agencies and boards cannot do it alone. And so we hope that others who participated in this and folks who will be reading it see themselves in this work, and they can help us work towards that vision. In this framework, we set some ambitious goals and some ambitious targets, which I'll discuss throughout the presentation here. And it's really about taking some short-term steps and some longer midterm steps that we can build on to get to climate action that helps us meet those goals. Now, I want to note that this does not lay out everything we need to do to meet our goals or build resiliency that we need to see, but really it provides that foundation. Next slide, please. So briefly, just want to touch on the vision that the Climate Action Framework sets for our state, and that's to be carbon neutral by 2050, to be resilient. And when we talk about resiliency, we want to ensure that Minnesota's communities, business, and natural environment can prepare and respond to the worst impacts of climate change, and that we allow an opportunity for all Minnesotans to thrive. And really at the heart of so much of this work is equity, making sure that we acknowledge there's currently disproportionate impacts as it relates to pollution and climate change, and we want to acknowledge those and understand how we can begin to address the disproportionate impact that climate will have, particularly among Black, Indigenous, and communities of color as well. So we have equity as a central tenet of this work. And the vision for the state, as we kind of touched on earlier, also acknowledges that we all have a role to play. And so we really invite folks to join us in this work. Next slide, please. One of the things that we heard throughout the course of developing the Climate Action Framework was the need for a bold target that is in line with the best available science. And so the Climate Action Framework aligns Minnesota's goals in relation to addressing climate change with the best available science, that of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it sets a goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. Being net zero by 2050, as I mentioned earlier, and making sure that we are prioritizing investments in climate adaptation and resiliency. As most of you are aware, this aligns with goals that have been set by other countries, by other states, and by other subnational governments. Some cities and other units of government have these goals. And as I stated earlier, we know that we need action by all levels of government, businesses, and individuals to help us achieve these goals, but it's what we need to do. So it's important that Minnesota have these goals set out in this document and that they become our North Star in guiding climate action. Next slide, please. So briefly, the framework goals are organized around 6 goal chapters. And you may have seen the document already, and these are not new goal chapters. They were what was contained in the draft that was released for public comment and input in February of this year. So we have clean transportation, climate smart natural and working lands, resilient communities, clean energy and efficient buildings, healthy lives and communities, and clean economy. And I'll touch a little bit on some of the measures of progress and the vision for each of these goal chapters next. Next slide. So when we think about transportation, we really want to think about a system that connects and serves all people in an equitable, safe, and sustainable manner. It's about providing options here. And the work of this action team and this work group has set some aggressive targets to help us realize how we can make progress in the #1 sector of greenhouse gas emissions. There's the goal and measure of progress for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2040. decreasing vehicle miles traveled, and this is something that was proposed in the statewide multimodal transportation plan. Thank you to Commissioner Daubenberger for leading that effort. And then continuing to work to accelerate the pace of adoption for electric vehicles and building off the goal contained in our electric vehicle vision document that was released in 2019 to reach 20% EVs on Minnesota roads by 2030. Next slide, please. Our next goal chapter is climate smart, natural, and working lands. And this goal chapter is really about recognizing how we can grow climate smart, natural, and working lands so they can absorb and store more carbons, reduce emissions, and then critically sustain local economies. There's an opportunity here for our producers, our growers, our foresters, people who are involved in our natural and working lands to realize climate benefits that are both environmental in nature as well as economic. And it sets some pretty bold and aggressive targets here for increasing the amount of carbon that we're sequestering in our natural and working lands, working with the agricultural sector to increase best management practices like cover crops and other things to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You'll see the goal for a 25% reduction from 2018 levels, and then continuing the good work of the DNR to make sure that our state managed lands are being managed in a way that is promoting climate resiliency and adaptation as well. Next slide, please. Resilient communities. And as I touched on earlier, it's really about making sure that Minnesota's communities have the tools they need to plan for and adapt to our changing climate, recognizing that each community is going to be impacted differently. And so the measures of progress in this are really making sure that all Minnesotans live in a community that has a climate adaptation plan and that we are supporting those planning efforts here. We want to fund at least 25 adaptation projects by 2026 at all scales, and making sure that we're also working to increase our tree canopy cover so we can combat issues with the rising temperature that Dr. Blumenfeld had talked about, and really trying to work on that urban heat island effect that we know disproportionately impacts folks who live in denser cities and areas with more concrete and blacktop. Next slide, please. Clean energy and efficient buildings. And as you may have gathered, this was a work group and an action team that is a bunch of overachievers here, as you can see by all the different measures of progress, but really focusing in on where we're sourcing our power and our generation and building off the Walls Flanagan administration for 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040, but then also thinking about the energy burden and making sure that folks who are least able to pay for rising heating and cooling costs are able to do so by adopting energy efficient practices. So really focusing on weatherizing our homes. Also thinking about our systems as well on the whole. So thinking about thermal GHG emissions and setting a goal for reducing those is pretty clear here. In addition, thinking about how we can capture waste heat. So minimizing those losses that are coming off from energy use and recycling those into systems, as well as another goal that has been proposed by this work group. And ultimately, as we said, we really want to reduce our statewide energy use, as you'll see by another one of these goals, thinking about what we're able to do with our buildings to make them as environmentally friendly as possible and as energy efficient as possible here. So next slide, please. Healthy lives and communities. And this is an action team and a work group that really was focusing on protecting the health and well-being of all Minnesotans, recognizing that our climate is changing. And so really wanted to lift up a couple of key components of this, one of which is aligning some of our work with the federal administration's work to ensure that 40% of funds certain funds for climate investments are going to disadvantaged and historically marginalized communities, increasing the diversity of our state workforce and really at that leadership level, and making sure we're doing our part to reduce heat-related ER visits as well. And it's really about making sure that everyone has the opportunity to thrive in the face of this changing climate and being thoughtful and planful as we think about communities and their individual needs here. Next slide, please. And our last goal chapter is clean economy. And this is about making sure that as we transition to a clean economy and we continue to grow clean economy jobs and green jobs, that everyone has access to those jobs, and being thoughtful about how we get into workforce development planning, be it reskilling, upskilling, or retraining generally. So thinking about what are all of the levers in the toolbox there to ensure that everyone has access to job training and other opportunities as well. Next slide. So what's next? This is a key component of the climate action framework, and it's a difference from the draft that was released earlier in the year with the final document released on Friday. And it's a discussion in the document, which I hope you all will engage with, to show how we can continue to use this framework to accelerate action, continuing to promote some of those ongoing priorities. I had mentioned the 100% carbon-free energy by 2040 as a particular goal area, but then also continuing to discuss how we can use this document to drive the budget and policy development process here. There are great ideas throughout this document, throughout the state action steps that we can carry forward as state agencies on our own. There are actions that we can work forward with the legislature, and there are actions for the private sector and individuals as well. So how do we use this information to make sure that's going forward? And that's a commitment there that this document will help us do. In addition to that, we clearly talk about how we can be accountable and continuing to build out some of our measurement and progress reporting processes. There is this section. And lastly, it sets those opportunities and those guideposts for guiding our climate action, thinking about the impact a particular action will have. How is it equitable or inequitable? How does it grow the economy? And how is it improving health and welfare? I believe I had about 7 minutes net for my presentation, so I kind of raced through things. I hope that's all right, but we're happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Craig. Appreciate it. And with that, yes, let's see what we have for questions from board members. Just looking for any hands up. Erik, is there anybody in the room with a raised hand or wanting to ask a question?
Chair Dobbenberger, we have Board Member Paul Nelson and Board Member Joseph Bauer-Kemper.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and presenters, quick question. Do you have any vision on how this will be overall coordinated?
Yes, great question. We do. The Climate Change Subcabinet was organized through Executive Order 1937 and pulls together those leaders of 15 different boards and agencies, as I mentioned, and the work will be continued to be coordinated by the Subcabinet, making sure that those interagency conversations that are critical are happening. But in addition to that, and perhaps even more importantly, is the engagement that we've had from agencies. And agencies will continue to push forward policy solutions and climate action steps. I highlighted some of the work that the Minnesota Department of Transportation is doing in setting robust goals and working to build out that equitable transit system, while also reducing vehicle miles traveled. And that'll be an opportunity for DOT to continue to lead. One example could be for the Pollution Control Agency. We are continuing to work on resiliency efforts when it comes to our stormwater and wastewater infrastructure and making sure that communities have the funds they need to enter into the planning process and then ultimately implementing those projects as well. And so those are two potential examples where you say there's some agency leadership, but above that, you'll also have the interagency coordination that the Subcabinet provides for ongoing conversations, topics, and development. So to make sure that when we're thinking about policy solutions, we're pulling in all of the right actors.
Thanks. This is Joseph Bauer-Kemper here in the room. Thank you. So thanks again for this great presentation. I noticed one of the components, one of the measures that was very specific and very near term was the 25 adaptation projects by 2026. And I'm wondering if that refers to a concrete existing program or multiple existing programs, or is there a new specific program associated with that? Or maybe that's not yet quite clear. So I'm just curious about that particular measure and how it will move forward.
Thank you for the question. This was an area where our resiliency work group spent a lot of time discussing it, recognizing that each community was at different spots for their adaptation plans, and a particular project could be something in the scale of a few $100,000 or tens of $1,000s to tens of millions of dollars here. So that was why we picked the 25, was to try and capture a host of different ideas and meet the unique needs of the communities. To the part about how we're going to continue to fund these, I think there's opportunities through existing channels and funding opportunities. The Pollution Control Agency in 2021 received additional funding to help communities in the planning process for stormwater infrastructure projects. And we have, I believe it was 11 grants we've distributed as part of that process to communities. And those are opportunities where you have a potential project that's for adaptation, but ultimately we want to get to implementation and continue to seek the necessary funds through the legislature and other opportunities, potentially through the Inflation Reduction Act or other federal legislation as it comes to just even larger scale projects. So it's really seeing something from the design process through the implementation period as well.
Thanks.
Thank you for that question, and thank you, Assistant Commissioner McDowell, for the presentation, the update on it. Thank you for your leadership in the climate action framework, along with Commissioner Kessler. We really appreciate the PCA leading us in this effort, and thanks to all the agencies involved too that have contributed to this. So, I'm sorry, there is one more question in the room, as I understand. Riley?
Yeah, thank you. Riley Hintz, public member, Congressional District 2. I'm just curious, among the various sectors of work within the climate framework, do you see any one of them as having the greatest potential to be carbon neutral? And if so, can you elaborate a bit? And then also, do you feel like there is a plan to direct resources more robustly towards what will have the greatest impact, or is it more equitable across the sectors?
Great. And for that one, I might actually turn it over to my colleague Frank Kohlasch, who's in the room and can handle some of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and maybe take it from that point of view. Frank?
Thank you, Craig. And for introductions, my name is Frank Kohlasch. I'm Climate Director for the for that question, we have tried to prioritize many of these actions based on the green magnitudes that they will see. So clearly, I think the one area which has the greatest opportunity to get to zero emissions or net zero is the electric generation sector. We made significant progress. It's the only sector that's on track to meet the Next Generation Energy Act goals. Our major investor-owned utilities have targets for 80% reductions in by 2030 and by 2035, and then so aspirational targets for net zero by the 2050 timeframe. And that really lays the foundation for then the use of that clean electricity in the other sectors. Some of the other sectors where we think we have significant opportunities and really significant bang for the buck and benefits for Minnesotans are the use of those that clean electricity in the building sector. So providing the heat and the air conditioning and the climate control in the residential sector, the commercial sector, and then looking for opportunities through the Natural Gas Innovation Act and the Energy Conservation Optimization Act, which were also passed in 2021, to build off of clean energy that we have, clean electricity, and drive down those emissions significantly. Then we're continuing to work with other states and the federal government about the transportation sector with various means and mechanisms that we have to continue to drive down emissions in those sectors. So we are looking at which areas, which of these measures of progress. It did go into our selection of what are the largest opportunities, and then being able to focus through our cross-agency discussions at the Climate Change Subcabinet to focus on where are the largest leverage points, how we can get there to continue progress, and then laying those foundations for the types of efforts that will then allow for additional emission reductions and building of resiliency in other sectors going forward.
Thank you, Craig, or excuse me, Frank. And again, thank you, Craig. And I think at this point, we should probably move on in the agenda. So we're a few minutes behind time. So, but great questions. And again, appreciate the PCA's leadership on the climate action framework. So our next item will be an update on the 2020 state water plan implementation. And Interim Director Dahl is going to provide that update. He is going to then introduce other experts who are here with us today on that. So I will turn it over to you, Erik.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all. I'm going to lead a presentation here today on an update on the 2020 State Water Plan, and I have a number of colleagues that helped, as well as you can see a list in the agenda of a bunch of the other state staff and Met Council staff that helped put this presentation together, and they're here to answer any questions after our meeting. But I'm here with Alicia Overbo from the Department of Health, Jeff Berg from the Department of Ag, Laura Milberg from the Pollution Control Agency, and Suzanne Reese from the Board of Water and Soil Resources. We're each going to give you an update on the state water plan different goals. Just a quick outline. As Dr. Blumenfeld indicated, climate change is a significant issue for Minnesota. And the development of the water plan, the interagency team spent a lot of time thinking about what strategies and actions could help achieve water plan goals that'll be exacerbated by climate change. Today's presentation will focus on providing the board highlights on new and innovative programs, projects, and funding that have advanced the 2020 water plan goals over the last year. We have a lot of information that we're going to talk about, so it'll kind of feel like a fire hose. There's just so much going on in the water space that relates to the state water plan that we didn't want to, we tried to not cut anything out. I wanted to let you know that the interagency water team also included additional implementation updates to the board, and they're in the board packet on page 15. And as we go through each goal, strategy, and action today, please take note that the board packet strategy table page numbers are on the slide. So the strategy table starts on page 9. And if you'd like to look at the full 2020 water plan, it's available on EQB's website. So we're going to start. Just a reminder that EQB is directed by the legislature to complete this plan every 10 years. The goal of the plan is to shine a spotlight on actions Minnesota can take to protect our waters from climate change. These are the 5 goals, and there's many details we're tracking on this plan, but our purpose today is to give you highlights on the progress on the plan. You can turn to page 9 in the board packet to follow along as we go through each goal, as we give you key highlights. It's also important to note that, as you just heard from Craig and Frank, that Minnesota's Climate Action Framework released last Friday also includes sub-initiative 3.2.3 to protect and improve water quality and quantity and prioritize the strategies identified to achieve the water plan's 5 primary goals listed here on the screen. So first, we're going to start with an update and highlight on Goal 1. Goal 1 is to ensure drinking water is safe and sufficient, with the 3 strategies to accelerate source water protection for community water systems, emphasize source water protection and watershed management, and prevent nitrate contamination of drinking water and groundwater. First, we're going to hear from Alicia Overbo from the Department of Health, and she's going to give you some updates on Goal 1. There we go.
Our first highlight is on the multi-community Western Metro project, Metropolitan. Alternative modeling.
Say, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Sarah Stroman. I don't know if others who are plugged in remotely are having the same issue, but I'm not able to hear much of anything. I was able to hear Erik fine.
Is this better?
Coming across soft for me too. Thanks.
That's much better. Thank you. I think you must have to be super close to the mic.
Okay. Should I start over with this slide? I can start over.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for letting us know. Our first highlight is on the multi-community wellhead protection pilot project in the Western Metro area. Through this pilot project, Metropolitan Council, Minnesota Department of Health, and Western Metro communities are working together to evaluate a new approach to wellhead protection planning, which refers to the modeling, planning, and activities to protect our groundwater sources of drinking water. And this pilot approach will be different from the city-by-city approach that we currently use. And the purpose is to have a more collaborative and coordinated approach for these communities that have overlapping wellhead protection areas. And it's going to be a more coordinated and collaborated way for these communities to work together to delineate, and plan, and have activities in their drinking water supply management areas, or DWSMAs, when they overlap across neighboring communities. So there are many benefits to this project, to Metropolitan Council, to Department of Health, to the communities, in terms of a lot of efficiencies. For instance, on this slide, you can see the blue areas of the map show where each of these different communities has different ideas about the groundwater vulnerability based on their groundwater modeling. And by having a single multi-community groundwater model, these communities will be able to save resources and also have a more shared and consistent idea of their groundwater vulnerability across the communities. So this approach will increase coordination between cities, between state and local government, and help protect these regional drinking water resources. Our second highlight is on financial assistance grants for private wells. Minnesota Department of Health has received clean water funds to provide 200,000 pilot grants, $100,000 pilot grants. These are ongoing and continue to be very successful. The grant recipients have been Horizon Public Health and Olmsted Soil and Water Conservation District. These two grant recipients are working with 9 communities, and through these grants, they've been able to provide free private well testing for arsenic, nitrate, and/or manganese to over 250 households so far. They've received over 250 results back from household and have helped many households either install treatment for drinking water or repair or reconstruct their wells. And independently, each of these grant recipients has taken the approach of collaboration and coordination between local public health and soil and water conservation districts, which has been a very successful model. Additionally, other grant opportunities are being leveraged to support private well testing and outreach. In fiscal year 2022, 5 of the 6 accelerated implementation grants were awarded for private well testing, treatment, and outreach. These totaled over $135,000. These grant funds are made possible by Clean Water Fund and are administered through the Groundwater Restoration and Protection Strategies Program, or GRAPS, and will support households that want to get their well tested for radium, nitrate, manganese, and/or arsenic, depending on which project they're in. Our third highlight is on the groundwater protection rule. The groundwater protection rule aims to minimize nitrate pollution in groundwater. The rule restricts application of nitrogen fertilizer in the fall and on frozen soils in areas that are vulnerable to groundwater pollution. In these areas, nitrate can easily move through the soil and into groundwater. The rule also outlines steps in areas where nitrate levels are already elevated in public water system wells. The rule restricts nitrogen fertilizer application in vulnerable drinking water supply management areas that have nitrate levels at or above 5.4 milligrams per liter. We're currently in the 3rd year of these fall and frozen soil nitrogen restrictions, and to date, Minnesota Department of Agriculture has received limited complaints. In the second part of the rule focuses on drinking water supply management areas that do have elevated nitrate and aims to manage the nitrate issues before they exceed drinking water standards in the wells. So in these priority drinking water supply management areas, or DWSMAs, local advisory teams advise Department of Agriculture on practices or requirements that can help reduce the nitrate levels in the DWSMA. Department of Agriculture is also using innovative computer modeling in each of these DWSMAs to estimate the nitrate leaching losses before and after implementation of nitrogen reducing practices. Our final highlight for the drinking water goal is on Irrigation Regional Conservation Partnership Program grants, or RCPP grants. The USDA NRCS RCPP awarded $3.5 million to Minnesota Department of Agriculture to build public-private partnerships on conservation irrigation practices. On this slide, you can see the blue area of the map shows the location of the 20 Soil and Water Conservation District partners that are working on this grant. They're also working with 12 other partners in these areas. One example of an irrigation water management practice being adopted comes from a farmer who has installed a variable rate irrigation system, and it estimates that using this variable rate technology cut his water loss by 30%. And with that, I'll turn it back to Erik.
All right, thank you, Alicia. Next, we're going to hear an update on Goal 2, managing landscapes to protect and improve water quality. Jeff Berg from the Department of Agriculture is going to lead us in an update on that. And here you go, I'll hand you. Wait. Oh, go back one.
So this is a goal 2, and we're going to actually have highlights for each of the strategies, that being soil health and ecosystem service markets. First highlight here is soil and water resources, Bowser grants that actually fund on the ground soil health practices. and hotel. So through Clean Water Fund, it's a competitive grant. 7 applications were recently funded in Minnesota. There's also a new round of funding. And also through general funds, there actually is non-competitive grants for each soil and water district to provide technical and financial assistance to get on the ground soil health practices. The second highlight here is a soil health plan for the state of Minnesota. So Bowser, through a McKnight grant, was funded to do a soil health action plan. Subsequent to that, this last legislative session, the legislator directed MDA to do a healthy soil management plan. So these sound and are very similar. So Bowser and MDA are collaborating together to actually develop a soil health action for the state of Minnesota. MOSH, or Minnesota Office of Soil Health at University of Minnesota, will lead on this effort, and it's early in the process, but the result will be is actions and measures for soil health. The second part of the legislation that passes 2022 legislative session is a directed Minnesota Department of Ag to develop a soil health equipment grant program. That was identified in various sources, including the state water plan as a barrier to actually implement soil health practices. It's something that's not funded, for example, on the federal level. So MDA is starting up the process of developing this grant program to fund equipment to help further the cause of implementing soil health in the state of Minnesota. Highlight number 3 is something else. So this slide and the next slide is talking about another initiative from the 2022 legislative session. It's 3 pieces of legislation and combining these 2 slides here. So regarding continuous living cover and the Forever Green initiative. So this actually complements many years of clean water funding to actually take Forever Green continuous living cover crops and get them implemented on the ground in the state of Minnesota. So it involves actually research, looking at the crops that'll grow in Minnesota, looking at different ways of growing them that they'll be profitable to farmers. And it also will pay for like infrastructure and equipment that's needed, so lab equipment, things like that, for the cause of research. And the third point is actually develop, help businesses and supply chains to actually take these crops and make products out of them. So the slide illustrates that there's a field of Kernza. And in this case, this is one that is starting to actually develop products. So you see there beer and cereal as well as pasta products. So that's the goal. So specifically for the Forever Green initiative, they've over the last few years been looking to go from the lab to the field. So here's a couple of examples of doing so. So the first 2 on the left there are actually winter oilseed crops, camelina and pennycress. And the thought there is to actually make the winter oilseed crop a cash cover crop. So hopefully get 2 cash crops in 1 year. So thought being that the oilseed crop would be planted in fall, soybeans would be planted into it in spring, the oilseed would be harvested, and later in the year the soybeans. We're looking to find the sweet spot in being able to do that. Second one, we talked about Kernza, or intermediate wheatgrass. University of Minnesota has released their first variety a couple of years ago, and next couple of years there'll probably another variety or 2 that the University of Minnesota will release. Another example is winter barley, where there's a Minnesota variety. So the 2 slides after this involve the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. So a little background of the program first. This is a voluntary program where the local government staff, soil and water district, MDA staff, and others will go out to farms, visit with the farmer and see what they're doing and see if they meet the water quality practices. There's over 900,000 acres that are enrolled in the program currently. The important point for the next 2 slides is that the middle bullet is measurements are made on the practices that are done. So the traditional water quality measurements, such as tons of soil saved, nitrate reduction, but also greenhouse gas reductions. So a specific endorsement, we call them, so I call it an extra with the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. So farmers may choose to get a climate smart endorsement. So what this is staff will visit with the producer and do a climate audit. So I assume some folks have done, home energy audits. It's similar to that, walk around and, see what could be done, see what kind of climate smart practices the farmer do. If the farmer chooses, there is through a McKnight Foundation, there is what's called a bridge payment. So a local trusted advisor will talk to the farmer and talk about different climate smart practices that can be done on the farm. $1,000 bridge payment is offered. So, because these are very complex, sort of things, these climate markets, this leads to the third and the final slide under goal. So right now there's being developed a carbon market guide for farmers. This is another McKnight Foundation grant being led by Minnesota Farmers Union and FLAG, Farmers Legal Action Group, where these folks will review the existing climate markets that are out there. They'll look at the agreements that exist. There's also a farmer review panel, and they're taking these complex markets and putting them into farmer-friendly terms. So that's ongoing now. This should be released in the next month or so. So with that.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. That was the update on goal 2. And so next we're going to hear about goal 3, which is managing our built environment and infrastructure for greater resiliency. In the past, we built stormwater infrastructure while only considering its main job, moving water away from developed areas to prevent flooding and not accounting for the associated harms. We now know that the way we have developed our built environment has disrupted the natural water cycle and led to flooding and water pollution. Climate change threatens to make these problems worse. Laura Milberg is here from the Pollution Control Agency to give us some updates on goal 3.
During the 2021 special session, the Minnesota Agriculture, which will generate future climate projections for use across Minnesota's diverse sectors, from agriculture and forestry to water resources and the built environment. It is particularly important in Minnesota to differentiate the impacts of climate change at a fine spatial scale because we have large south to north gradients and warming, long duration snow cover, large and small lakes, and other complexities that affect our climate. This project will produce climate projections at approximately 3-mile resolution for the entire state. These data will be made available to the public through an interactive web tool with projections for 3 climate scenarios during 3 steps in time: mid-century starting 2040, late century, and end of century ending 2100. The computer modeling already is underway using the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute. The U Spatial team has assigned experts to design a public-facing interactive data tool for free and easy access to the climate projection data, and focus groups have been conducted and are ongoing with data users to inform the design and anticipated uses of the interactive data tool. So model analysis is expected to be completed by January 2023, and the online data tool will be live by December 2020. Planning grants for stormwater and wastewater and community resilience were funded in the 2021 legislature. That was a new program for local government water infrastructure. The $1 million appropriation for each year of the current biennium was far too little to provide construction funding. So MPCA created this planning grants program. Local governments and tribal nations which share Minnesota's geography are eligible to receive the grant. The fiscal year 2022 request for proposals received 49 applications for a total of just under $3 million. Evaluation scoring prioritized projects that benefit areas of concern for environmental justice, projects that address localized flooding, and projects outside the 7-county metropolitan area. This past March, 12 grantees were awarded a total of $920,000, mostly for projects with stormwater modeling and evaluation of options to address localized flooding for more frequent intense precipitation events. A couple of the funded projects address planning to reduce urban heat island impacts, and one project combined work in all 3 grant categories. The 12 stormwater, wastewater, and community resilience planning projects awarded grants in FY22 reached all areas of the state. MPCA Commissioner Kessler headlined media events in Moorhead, the Cloquet-Duluth area, and the Austin-Cedar watershed area this summer to draw attention to the importance of planning for climate adaptation and resilience. Media pages with statistics, video clips, and other resources from the resilience grants outreach events around the state are available from MPCA. This fall, 3 separate requests for proposal will utilize the $1 million fiscal year 3 appropriation to support planning of resilient stormwater, wastewater, and community infrastructure. An RFP targeted at small communities under 10,000 is open right now. See the MPCA website for more information and upcoming opportunities. Future funding, as mentioned during the framework discussion, for climate resilience water infrastructure is a critical issue. The base appropriation for the grants that were given to MPCA is $250,000 annually for continued water infrastructure. And this amount is not nearly enough, just given the level of demand for the planning grants to date. The MPCA submitted a large supplemental budget proposal in 2022, targeted at funding the types of construction projects for resilient stormwater, wastewater, and community infrastructure not prioritized by the Clean Water Revolving Fund. Since that proposal was not funded, we plan to again seek funds for a combination of implementation projects, climate action and resiliency planning, and technical assistance to communities and tribal governments. We also are seeking funding opportunities through the federal government for infrastructure and resilience investments and exploring ways to match the federal funds to build climate resiliency for Minnesota. MPCA conducted its first proof of concept drone missions in 2021 for biomonitoring and other programs with big benefits for efficiency, effectiveness, and staff safety. These photos show how drones can provide unparalleled documentation of erosion and sedimentation, increasingly made worse by climate change. The right-hand photo is the Rainy River ice break this spring. The Metropolitan Council has created a new mapping tool for the Twin Cities metro area called Growing Shade, available for anyone to use on its website. The tool is intended to help communities enhance and preserve tree canopy. It interweaves map data with local stories and qualitative information centering the themes of sustainability and equity. The tool was developed for planners, foresters, and others to show how improvements in tree canopy can help address larger problems like environmental justice inequities, climate change, public health, and conservation of natural resources. MnDOT is supporting multiple research projects related to climate change impacts and resilience. It will use the results to develop strategies for managing climate-related risks to transportation infrastructure. See the MnDOT sustainability page for more information. MnDOT is also developing climate resilience performance measures that will be used to determine if the multimodal system is becoming more or less resilient to climate change. Examples of proposed measures include the percent of seeding using native vegetation, percent of highway culverts in poor or very poor condition, and dollars spent on flooding and washouts. These performance measures will support MnDOT's Resilience Improvement Plan and unlock access to future federal funds, such as the PROTECT program. And now back to Eric.
Thank you, Laura. So next we'll hear an update on Goal 4, managing landscapes to hold water and reduce runoff. Climate change, as you've heard, is resulting in more extreme rainfall events, and the impacts have been felt in the Minnesota River Valley and other southern Minnesota watersheds, creating more impetus for water storage and drainage management. We're going to hear from Suzanne Reese from the Board of Water and Soil Resources.
Eric. This is another example. You'll notice there's a common theme on some of these slides that projects that were funded by the legislature in 2021 are coming to fruition this year through a variety of grant programs. For example, the soil health grant programs that Jeff was mentioning. In this case, about $2 million was provided for this biennium for a water quality and storage pilot grant program. You can see in the first part of the legislative language here. The legislation specifies priority be given to Minnesota River Basin and the lower Mississippi River Basin, where I think the effects of climate change on stream flow and localized flooding were increasingly evident, and there was a lot of local impetus. So in establishing this grant, Bowser looked at a couple of things, and we have some background information that's in the rest of your packet about some work that's been done. We've created a white paper to help local governments plan for various types of storage, depending on what their goals are. Keep in mind, generally the goal of adding water storage is either to reduce runoff volume, which is what you see on the upper of these hydrographs. You're reducing the total volume, or you're altering the timing of the runoff so that the peak flows are reduced and extended over a longer period. And different practices yield different results. So the non-structural practices, the soil health practices that increase infiltration can reduce volume, where the structural practices tend to shift the timing. But in developing the program, Bowser established a set of funding priorities, which you see here, looking at what else was happening in a particular watershed, how much was the rate or volume of the runoff being reduced, what were the other multiple benefits, and was the project shovel ready? In other words, had some preliminary engineering been done so that they could actually move ahead? Because these projects have a long lead time. There were 7 total applications for $3.8 million. Remember, the total is $2.2 million over the biennium. 3 projects were chosen to be funded, total of a little over $800,000. 2 in Lyon County and 1 in LeSueur County. And notice, okay, the example, the upper image here is from LeSueur County. This was a modification of an existing wetland to increase its area and add storage capacity. The lower image is a ravine project in Lyon County, which is a grade stabilization project to reduce peak flows and the down cutting and erosion of that particular ravine. So fairly small project areas is what we're seeing. And of course, this is a pilot program, and $2 million does not go very far in putting projects on the ground, but there'll be another round of funding next year. And we may see additional opportunities from the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts. The second highlight is the MDA's research and demonstration sites. And this is an ongoing program. MDA maintains these sites across the state to reflect different conditions, to work with the ag community and promote peer-to-peer learning that is close to where farmers actually live, and they collect a variety of data. What is new here is that there's a new site that has been developed at Farm America in Waseca County, which is going to be focused on drainage water management. And drainage water management is, along with water storage, is probably the other big component in Goal 4. In this case, there are 4 drainage plots here, 2 with drainage water management and 2 without. And I think we can supply more information on that as it goes along. And then the last highlight in this area is the drainage work group and the drainage management team, which Bowser coordinates, but which have a broad stakeholder and agency representation, have been looking at early coordination opportunities for drainage projects. The drainage statute, which is Chapter 103E, has these opportunities for early coordination, sharing information before a drainage project is petitioned and then before the preliminary engineering report is initiated. However, those are not always used, and sometimes it doesn't even happen. So the DNR is kind of taking the lead here to work with agencies and other stakeholders on this approach. Also try to better align drainage management with watershed scale planning under one watershed, one plan. So thank you. Back to Erik.
Thank you, Suzanne. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Goal 5 last, which is to promote resiliency and quality of life. As you know, water is vital for meeting basic human needs such as drinking, washing, growing food. But water provides benefits beyond basic needs. It enhances quality of life. Water is part of the Minnesota identity and integral to recreation, livelihood, spirituality, and sense of well-being of many Minnesotans. Highlight 1 is about mental health impacts of climate change. In 2019, the Minnesota Department of Health and other partners surveyed mental health professionals to assess knowledge, attitudes, and practices related to climate change and mental health. The survey was completed by over 500 professionals, and the results are being published in a peer-reviewed journal. The majority of respondents reported seeing climate-related impacts on mental health and well-being among their clients. They also reported a lack of professional support on this topic. To address this gap, the Climate and Community Mental Health Symposium was held in April 2022. This symposium brought together mental health professionals, scientists, and students to hear about the survey, learn about resources, and share ideas. Continuing this highlight, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency also held a youth panel to discuss climate anxiety this summer, featuring a presentation and panel of young speakers. There's not much research around this topic, particularly as it relates to certain youth demographics. One message that emerged from the youth panel was the sense that not much was happening on climate change outside of the Twin Cities metro area. Yet there are many climate-related projects spread throughout the state, so the takeaway is that we can do more to engage youth in these projects. We collectively continue to think of ways the state can better incorporate the voice of youth in our climate actions. Highlight 2 is about farm and rural stress. Weather has been a point of stress and will be increasingly so with climate change. Just as in the last couple of years in Minnesota, we've had drought, flooding, storms, avian influenza, and they've all impacted farmers, sometimes more than one of these. To provide assistance for drought in 2022, Governor Walz proposed and the legislature responded and provided $8.1 million of drought relief funding. There were 3,000 applications that requested $18.9 million, illustrating the genuine need. The Department of Agriculture will continue to highlight and respond to rural stress needs through programs noted on the slide here, from Minnesota Farm and Rural Helpline to Farm Advocate Program to Minnesota Rural and Mental Health Specialists. And there's more information on coping with farm and rural stress at the website located. Another update here is on that MDA has emphasized and expanded services to young, beginning immigrant and other farmers. This has included convening an emerging farmers working group and establishing an emerging farmers office in 2021. In addition to the programs noted here, recently the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, signed a $3.82 million cooperative agreement with the Department of Agriculture to establish a program that will allow communities to determine how local food can be procured and distributed among underserved communities. So that's Goal 5, and I wanted to also touch on Lake Superior highlights. That's part of the Minnesota State Water Plan in 2020. We just have time to give you 2 updates on Lake Superior. There's a lot of work happening around Lake Superior, and the interagency water team provided more updates on the board packet and on page 22. And we had even more to present in the presentation, but to stay with time, just I'm going to focus on a couple. Looking for green infrastructure opportunities as roads and stormwater infrastructure come up for scheduled replacement is a good way to provide match for grants. St. Louis County makes partners aware of its planned work years in advance and consults with stream experts to determine if there is an opportunity for green infrastructure or aquatic passage improvements. This project in Duluth along Woodland Avenue is using match from existing work to create a large wetland complex, outlined in green on the map here, or on the picture, to treat stormwater that has historically entered this trout stream untreated. There's some benefits including E. coli reduction and suspended sediments entering the trout stream. Lake Superior coaster brook trout are a rare native Minnesota gem that can grow to over 20 inches long. Lake-wide rehabilitation of coaster brook trout populations has been a high priority for fisheries agencies after habitat alteration, warming water temperatures, and overharvest in the late 1800s and 1900s caused severe declines in abundance. One aspect of rehabilitation is identifying watersheds that produce coaster brook trout and identify climate change resilience strategies to ensure cold water habitat is available to these fish. This project is using genetic information to identify which tributaries are contributing most to the coaster populations found in Lake Superior, so resources can be better focused on specific areas for habitat protection, enhancement, and restoration if needed. And so this concludes our updates on the 2020 State Water Plan. As I mentioned in your board packet on page 22, there's more updates as well as there's a whole panel of staff that are available, many of them online and some of them sitting right here that can answer some more questions. Progress on the 2020 Water Plan continues, but barriers remain from funding to adoption of climate smart practices. There are many future challenges facing water in Minnesota, and climate change will exacerbate these challenges. Planning for the future of Minnesota's water must include an honest appraisal of the effects of our changing climate and what it's having on the vital resources and how these changes will impact Minnesotans, wildlife, habitat, and landscapes across the state. Fortunately, the actions we take to improve water quality and manage water quantity, from soil health, as you heard today, to water storage, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help us adapt to a changing climate. And so we will be coming back every year to give regular annual updates on the 2020 Water Plan similar to this, but perhaps the board would like to hear more in-depth presentations throughout the year, because I know this is a lot to take in. We do have the EQB produces a 5-year policy report, and that's due in September 2025. So that'll be something EQB will be working on with our interagency partners. And I have a next slide that just has my name, but I thank Alicia, Jeff, Laura, and Suzanne, as well as if you look in your agendas there, there's a whole list of folks that helped put this presentation together and are available online to answer any questions you might have. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Erik, and thank you to Alicia and Jeff and Laura and Suzanne for reporting out on these updates to the 2020 Water Plan, and really appreciate the progress that's been made. So thank you for highlighting some of that for us this afternoon. And as Erik mentioned, if you have questions, you could reach out to him. He'll connect you with the right expert that we have in the room there as well as online. But I know we do have a couple minutes in case there's any general questions that anybody has. And I see Susan Vento has a question in the chat. So let me go to that.
Yes, Madam Chair. I'm wondering if the infrastructure grants include townships. There are some grant programs that exclude townships, and I just want to be clear on that.
They do include townships.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you for that question, Susan. And I think there's another question from Riley.
Yeah, thank you. This is Riley Hintz, District 2 public member. This is probably a little beyond the presentation you all or the updates you all gave today, but I'm just curious about reactions to it. And if I can loop Frank in for one question too, kind of bringing the two pieces together. One of the items in the climate update was a 25% increase in carbon sequestration by 2035. And then also we're talking about nitrate reduction and working lands and productive lands, like bringing all of these together. I'm curious if there's an estimate of the number of acres of perennials to reach that carbon sequestration goal. And then similarly, I think there are some estimates out there of the number of perennials to reach our nitrate goals. And then where I'm going with all of that is um, it has been very challenging to reach water quality goals through voluntary measures or regulatory measures without a huge investment in money that honestly the state doesn't have enough to reach those goals. So looking at various market-based approaches and thinking about the potential there, and given that there may be, quite a bit of federal money coming into the table to make the investments that some of you have been talking about, I'm curious, is there any momentum around mandates that might help set firmer standards that could correspond with investments to kind of shift the market towards this perennial need that we have for multiple goals? So I know that's a lot, and like would love if we could just solve all of this right here. But if there's just any reaction to it or thoughts or any, appreciate it.
Thank you for the question. Again, Frank Kohlasch, Climate Director for Pollution Control Agency. I see everybody looking at me until I start the answer off. To your initial question on the total number of acres, do we have that estimate? We don't have that estimate, and it is. I want to make sure that we put it in the context of that goal is also including our forest lands, our grasslands, our peatlands, our wetlands, a number of landscapes across Minnesota that we're looking to make the storage. So it's not going to be just relying upon the croplands and the perennial types of grains. It's going to be relying upon multiple types of landscapes across Minnesota. That was something that we heard really clear from our stakeholders, was that we needed to identify those landscapes that had the highest opportunity for storing carbon, and then also look for those goals and be able to set baselines and identify what is possible across all of those landscapes and have conversations with stakeholders on those landscape specific discussions, because it was really difficult in some of the accelerated meetings that we had for the framework to try to talk about forest lands and grasslands in the same discussion in the same 2 hours. That's an ongoing discussion we're going to have to, and then really make sure that we're finding additional voices in all of those discussions and making sure they're part of the outreach and engagement for how Minnesota can build carbon storage and build soil health and protect water quality, really get multiple benefits across those separate landscapes by focusing on the people that are most knowledgeable, most involved, and most touching those landscapes most specifically. Make sure that Minnesota is well positioned to meet our carbon storage carbon storage goals, our water quality goals, our soil health goals, and our economic development. And I think that I'll leave it there to see if anybody else wants to add anything on other part of the question.
So Jeff Berg, Minnesota Department of Ag, just to put a finer point on that. So as Assistant Commissioner McDonnell said, this is a climate subcabinet, involves multiple agencies. In fact, a couple at the table here were involved with the Climate Action Framework. The beauty of Environmental Quality Board, it is also multi-agency, so there's cross-pollination there, right? So I know for myself and probably others here is, working on the Climate Action Framework, specifically the natural working land, section. We thought about the state water plan, and we thought about the next presentation that'll be at the Clean Water Council strategic plan. So we thought about how those things can collaborate together to meet the state goals. So the long answer, no, there's not a specific number, but there's certainly strength in numbers that these different plans do talk about how many perennials, nitrogen and manure management, for water quality benefit, as Frank talked about, but also greenhouse gas reduction. So thank you.
All right. Let me just check to see if anyone else had anything to add to that. Otherwise, I think we're going to need to move on in the agenda. Check.
Oh, there we go. Commissioner Tom Peterson, Department of Agriculture. I just say one other thing that happened last week that is really going to add a lot. We hope is going to add a lot of perennial cover as the USDA announced this Climate Smart Commodities Program. And that I think in our staff looking at it, we think there's at least 12 of those awards that touch Minnesota. And we, hope that money gets out to, the landowners for that purposes. It's a lot of money. I mean, you look at this Wright project or Butera or Organic Valley. I mean, you're talking about $80 million for each entity. So I think it's really going to accelerate, hopefully, if we can, just coordinate all of this. So we'll see. Again, it's voluntary. We have the other part that's not voluntary going on with the Groundwater Protection Act, which I'll admit is challenging, but working on. But I'm excited about the other part.
Thank you, Commissioner Peterson. All right. And again, thanks to all those who have been contributing to the progress on the 2020 water plan and the updates today. And I understand we'll get those annually, so that's great. Thank you all. So then the next item is the Clean Water Council and Clean Water Fund update from Paul Gardner, the administrator of the Clean Water Council.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Just checking to make sure
Thanks. Maybe if you're just talking a little closer to the microphone, you're very soft for me.
Oh, okay. How's this? I'm closer.
Better. Thank you.
Very good. So this is like a radio thing. I walked in as Mr. Kohlasch was sitting here, not saying anything. His lips weren't moving, but voices coming over. Some telepathic microphone that was working, but apparently not. Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Gardner. I'm the administrator for the Clean Water Council. I was asked if I could talk about where we're going with the Clean Water Fund for our recommendations in fiscal 24 and 25 and just council in general. You heard some cross sections of where we're going with the Clean Water Fund. Generally speaking, through the previous presentations, you probably saw the legacy logo on many of the slides where you heard some details about key programs. I'd like to give you an overview of the strategic vision of what we'd like to do with the fund its expiration. Very good. This is the obligatory slide explaining the Clean Water Council. We are a state advisory council created in 2006 as part of the Clean Water Legacy Act. Clean Water Legacy Act has to do with identifying and addressing impairments on our surface waters and protection and restoration of groundwater. In 2009, the council was given the additional task of allocating or recommending how to spend the Clean Water Fund, which I'll mention in a moment. We do have, just for your reading pleasure, a list of constituencies that are represented by the voting members of the Clean Water Council. They are appointed by the governor. And then we also have 6 agency members, the University of Minnesota, and 4 legislators, and they're non-voting members. The Clean Water Land Legacy Amendment, time is going by and not everybody actually knows about it, but I was a member of the House of Representatives when we put this on the ballot in 2008, and it passed by overwhelming margins with 56% of the vote. In 2008, it adds 0.3% to our state sales tax for 25 years until June 30th, 2034 at midnight. I want to have one of those digital countdown clocks at my cube so it shows up in all my Zoom calls behind everybody to put some pressure on people. By the time the fund is no longer accumulating funding, it's likely at current rates that we'll see over $3 billion, dollars appropriated for the clean. The constitutional language is that we can only spend it on protection, enhancement, restoration of water quality, and to protect groundwater and drinking water sources. It is quite annoying when speakers read their slides, so I'm not going to read the slide, but state statute does say that there's more specificity than just the constitutional amendment for these statutory, here's what we can do in statute with the Clean Water. The one thing I will articulate is that the Constitution does specify that at least 5% of the Clean Water Fund must be used to protect drinking water sources. And I'm pleased to say we've done the math and we're well above that. We have received a lot of Constructive communications. When I took the job 3.5 years ago, I asked lots of external stakeholders interested in the success of the fund what they thought of how things were going. And the main complaint we got from people is that we showed people a lot of puzzle pieces of individual programs, but not how all the pieces fit together in a cohesive whole. So I'm here just to lay out that strategy in one slide, actually two. I have used in bold the plain language version of how we deploy money with the Clean Water Fund for surface waters, and in parentheses, I use the language that will be recognized by my agency colleagues behind me, the various water lingo that we use on a daily basis. But generally speaking, with surface waters, we test the water to figure out if there's something wrong with it. If there is something wrong with it, we figure out what the source of that problem is, come up with a set of strategies to fix the problem, and then we come up with a plan that has a punch list, more or less, of activities that need to happen to get to water quality standards in each of our major 80 watersheds. We're almost done with that, what we call watershed restoration and protection strategy development for our 80 major watersheds. You can see in the upper left that we've only got actually 77 watersheds now. There are only 3 watersheds left. And then Bowser works with local stakeholders to come up with a comprehensive watershed management plan, which is essentially that punch list of everything we need to do, but then it's used as a way to sum up the science and help local stakeholders figure out how to allocate those funds in a prioritized way. Because we know we can't do everything, and we certainly can't do it once. Then we measure to figure out whether the project, then we fund money on projects. That's important. Everything from setting aside land to providing expertise to landowners on how they can do things to do better on them. And then we essentially move dirt in restoring landscapes, streams, protect lake shores, as you see in one of the pictures here. We assist with septic system inspection and replacement. And then later we measure again to see if the projects that have taken place actually do as desired. That whole process there can sometimes take 5 to 10 years, if not longer. This totally incomprehensible chart required a little bit of red annotation here, but in each one of these comprehensive watershed management plans done by local watersheds with support from Bowser through a Clean Water Fund grant, they come up with a list of everything you need to do to get to water quality standards. This page from the 2016-ish River watershed plans shows a range of activities that have to happen at a certain scale. Do those projects and do them by a certain year, you should get the desired reductions in pollutants such as nutrient sediment to meet water quality standards. And we even have a pretty good idea what the price tag will be for each of these watersheds, and there are 80. We know that the price tag, when they are all completed shortly after 2025, will exceed the dollars available for the clean landowner contributions, federal money, and others. And we may have to leave some things by the wayside, but prioritize others. A picture says 1,000 words. This slide demonstrates our approach with drinking water. This is a satellite photo of the city of Verndale in Wadena County. I know you didn't miss it in the picture of the state of Minnesota on the groundwater protection rule. There's a little red dot for Verndale because its nitrates are too high in its drinking water supply. The municipal boundary is the gold line on the top half of the picture, and then the wellheads for this town are right along Highway 10, which bisects the town. And you'll see some blue lines extending out from the wellhead. It's a wellhead protection area where stuff that essentially is on the land could end up in the well within the next. The difficult thing is that wellhead protection area extends beyond municipal boundaries. So cities have limited abilities to get landowners to do things to protect water supply outside the city boundary. So using the Clean Water Fund, the Department of Health has delineated what you heard before as a DWSMA, a drinking water supply management area. That's in the yellow and black hatched line. That covers the entire area that we want to protect to avoid any contaminants ending up in the well. That then kicks in a whole bunch of other activities like a drinking water source protection plan done by the Department of Health with water supplier. And that also has a punch list of things needed to protect and restore the drinking water in the city. And that can include activities by the Department of Ag, by Bowser, by the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, everything from land exchanges to easements to very intensive technical assistance to help farmers reduce the amount of nitrogen going into the soil, to planting kernza or other perennial crops provided by the Forever Green program. There are 920 plus of these WISMAs in the state. There are 23 surface water drinking water systems around the state, such as Minneapolis, St. Paul, Mankato, St. Cloud, where there's a process somewhat similar to this. But I didn't want to bombard you with 20 slides here. I wanted to stress what the value of the Clean Water Fund is to Minnesota, because I've had a chance to talk to colleagues in other states and crunch some numbers. There are things in Minnesota we can do with the Clean Water Fund that other states cannot do. For example, in the graph here, provided by the Department of Ag, thanks to money from the lottery for equipment and staff supported by the Clean Water Fund, Department of Ag's pesticide lab has been able to analyze and detect more pesticides and their degradates over time than we have been able to do in the past. So you can see the bump after the Clean Water Fund was ratified. For better or worse, we can detect and analyze more neonicotinoid samples, for example, because of capacity than most other states. We information to a larger national database, and so something of akin of one of the better systems in the country. We're able to do what we were required to do before the Clean Water Fund and couldn't do. And I think Commissioner Peterson was around for that discussion, which was we couldn't complete all the total maximum daily load reports to determine an acceptable amount of contaminants in our waters. Now we can. We're also able to have more accurate monitoring data, not just to have monitoring data because we use it. There are wastewater treatment plants that have less costly systems installed because they have an accurate idea of how much phosphorus they can put in their effluent because we have accurate monitoring data instead of just a conservative guess. When we don't have monitoring data, the PCA tends to be more conservative in assuming how much phosphorus you can put out with a permit. So it might be higher, and without the data, cities would have to spend tens of millions of dollars to get their permit. We undersell this, but we have more expertise available throughout the state. We did a field tour to the southwestern part of the state, and we had folks from Bowser, the Department of Health, PCA, and the DNR all talk about the things they're doing to help local water suppliers figure out the state of their groundwater is, the supply, the direction, the quality, and then assisting landowners to resolve the problem. We are also able to enhance compliance. So we used to have a much lower compliance rate for septic systems when they're inspected before the Clean Water Fund. Now we're over 80% compliance, and we have a stretch goal of 90%. Let's see. I do want to mention that the Clean Water Fund, compared to other states, allows us to have more shovel-ready projects ready more quickly. An example is the St. Louis River area of concern, where we've helped clean up the Duluth Harbor and points upstream because the Clean Water Fund was the initial dollar put on the table to help with the planning, which then attracted bonding dollars and federal money. And suddenly we're close to finishing up the cleanup work by 2025 in the St. Louis River. We also are able to leverage a lot of technical assistance to farmers and cost share assistance from the federal government because of what our state and local partners can do with the cleanup. We've also chipped in for the state's share of the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP, which has attracted, we're close to $350 million from the federal government for almost $175 million in state funding. We've also helped leverage a lot of federal money for communities around Voyageurs National Park, which have a very difficult geologic context in which to have sewage treatment. So we've helped. The good news is here, well, it's all good news, but for every dollar in clean water funds we use, we bring in more than $1 in leveraged funds. And that does not include the landowner contributions, which are awfully hard to track. So for every buck we put in, we get more than a buck in other value. I did want to mention a couple things in our strategic plan. We did align our plan with the state water plan so that we were not diverging in different directions. But there's some big strategic goals here that I wanted to share with you. One is that we would like to see 200,000 acres in the upper Mississippi headwaters protected and restored, priority acres that would ensure high quality water indefinitely before it's plowed or paved or developed. Within those 920-ish DWISMAs are 400,000 acres total in the state. The health department tells me that they can protect 400,000 acres by 2034. The ag certification program, they're almost at 1 million acres. They believe they can get to 6.5 million acres, I think, by 2030 to 2034. But a very ambitious number, about a quarter of the state involved. We also support the Met Council in their efforts to reduce groundwater consumption by 150 million gallons a year. We've actually exceeded that with things like water efficiency grants to cities to help people install more efficient irrigation controllers, replacing toilets and other fixtures and the like. And I mentioned the septic system. Finally, just some highlights from our tentative recommendations pending the November budget forecast. We have more money available now for shovel-ready projects, so we're putting in another 35-ish million to Bowser for projects that are listed in their One Watershed, One plans, the comprehensive plans. We're going to increase, if appropriated, the money going to Forever Green by 50%. We'll have more grants for cities to reduce chloride from water softeners and road salt. We'll have more low-income grants available for counties to give to households that have septic systems that are out of compliance and they can't afford to repair. We'll also have a couple of water storage projects through Bowser and DNR, and we'll work on many of the projects mentioned in the state plan on soil health. We also want to increase our capacity to address emerging threats. So we are going to have more money available at the health department to analyze PFAS compounds. We're even looking at microplastics at the MPCA. DNR has a couple of projects like mussel restoration and culvert redesign cost share to help improve water continuous flow, which is good for water quality. We have been leaving some money on the table for Great Lakes Restoration Initiative because we didn't have a local match. We'd like to alleviate that. And I'm sad to say we have not had something that Iowa and Wisconsin have, which is a beach monitoring website where beach closing information isn't centralized in one place. Finally, I'll mention something that was alluded to by Ms. Overbo, health, which is that we plan to support, if appropriated by the legislature, a free well test for private well owners for 5 major contaminants statewide over the course of 10 years. So 10% of the state over 10 years. That is a fairly bold initiative, and my understanding is that we'd like to consider future funding for mitigation, like the septic system program, where we might help purchase a reverse osmosis system for low-income households, for example, that might not be able to afford it. So I'll leave you with this great picture of Rice Creek in Arden Hills and Shoreview near my house, which was restored using a Bowser grant from the Clean Water Fund, turned a ditch back into a stream, and now it's one of our better water or recreation assets in North Metro. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Paul, for that update. A lot of information that you were able to provide us. I don't see any hands up for questions, but let me do a check. Any questions there from folks in the room, Erik?
I'm used to speaking last at conferences, so I understand all the expressions I'm seeing on people. Can't absorb any more.
I'm not seeing any hands, Chair Dobbenberger. Oh, I guess we have one from Paul Nelson. Here you go. Paul.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Madam Chair and Paul, we've heard a lot today about various projects and so forth. Wondering, and it may not be directed to you, that or is it possible at some time to have an update on regarding nitrate phosphorus or sediment? I know Met Council and their Big Rivers monitoring program as they go through the metro, and there's a lot of good information there, exception of we hear a lot about project, but I'd like to know at some point a little trends.
Very good.
And Paul, could you repeat the question? It was a little fading in and out for me. If you wouldn't mind repeating or summarizing it, that'd be great.
I'm not used to speaking into a mic. Sorry. I'm curious about overall water quality trends. We heard a lot about projects and programs, but I'm wondering in terms of the trends themselves in the resource, what's happening?
Sure. And every 2 years, the agency performance report, a lot of very detailed metrics, and some of them, which is phosphorus numbers on the big rivers, are going down, which is good, but nitrate levels are going up. I've noticed that the larger the scale you look out, the harder it is to see change. The smaller the scale, the easier it is to look at. And I've been actually talking to the agencies about ways that we can graphically show, say, first the detection of an impaired water, and then the activities funded by the Clean Water Fund that are in that watershed, and then see what the trend is.
Thank you for that. Let me just do a quick check. Any other questions there in the room? No other hands is the note I just got from Erik. Okay, I think we're going to need to move on. So then our next item is a board discussion about the 50th anniversary of the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA. And we have Faith Krogstad to give a presentation before we open it to discussion. So Faith, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, members of the board and of all the participants and panelists in the room. My name is Faith Krogstad, and I'm the Engagement and Communications Director for the Environmental Quality Board. I'm before you today to present information about the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA, and the 50th anniversary of EQB, and seek ideas and guidance from the board to inform the celebration project intentions and scope. I developed a memo to the board to provide some background on this topic, which you may find on packet pages 36 and 37. Next slide, please. So I'm going to approach this presentation a little differently than I first expected. I'd like to share some of my research into the origins of MEPA and EQB in the hope that it will help us tease out what we want to do and emphasize in the celebration. So we'll start with that and move into the opportunity of the celebration, our draft project intentions and planning considerations, next steps for the project, and following that we'll have a discussion and brainstorm for the celebration. Next slide, please. So what is this project? The year 2023 will mark the 50th anniversary of MEPA and the codification of EQB in statute. This project is about how we are going to celebrate the Act and EQB in the year 2023. Next slide. So my first task with this project was to begin wrapping my head around MEPA. The more I looked into it, the more questions I had. I looked into session law, statute, historical documents and articles, and talked to people familiar with MEPA, but everywhere I looked, I found slightly different accounts of its scope and purpose. So we'll start out, what is MEPA? Everyone agrees that it's a landmark environmental law in Minnesota, passed in 1973 with strong bipartisan support. And then there were a couple of questions I had a hard time answering that were sort of central to the question of what are we celebrating with this occasion. And initially I was going to say I don't expect we were going to answer these today, but while this meeting was going on, I got an email from Senate Counsel who supports the Senate Environmental Committees, and he sent over an answer to the first one. So where is it in statute? Everyone seems to agree that 116D is MEPA, but sometimes people lumped in 116C, which created the Environmental Quality Board. So I found an interview with the senator who introduced the MEPA bill, Bob Dunn, and he referenced a conflict about the makeup of the board in the bill, and he said they broke the bill in half, separating the board from the policy. So it seems like originally the idea was to have EQB included in MEPA, but when it came to passage, they were in separate bills. And the email that I got from Senate Counsel basically said, technically they're in separate acts, and you can't say that the creation of EQB is within MEPA. So I guess that question is answered on a legal basis, but we know that they're related. So the next question is really, what is the core of MEPA? Is it a broad policy elevating environmental concerns in the work of state government, or is it just shorthand for the establishment of state-level environmental review? Or is it a combination of both, sort of that big picture, forward-looking, head in the clouds type stuff, and then the specific boots on the ground, procedural environmental review piece? So Statute 116D has lofty goals and principles, language directing state agencies to take action for the environment and future generations, and also language creating environmental review. In 116D, EQB is directed to oversee environmental review, so we can see that linkage there. So the answer to this second bullet could influence what we choose to celebrate and emphasize and how we talk about the celebration. So already I'm thinking we might need to think about calling this the MIPA and EQB 50th anniversary celebration, for example. Next slide. We know we want to celebrate the 50th birthday of EQB. And so I wanted to look into the origins of EQB and then what is at our core. It was originally created by executive order in 1972 as the Environmental Quality Council. It was codified in Statutes 116C in 1973. In the findings, the idea was that addressing environmental issues requires interagency collaboration and debate, should be encouraged to increase understanding by the public and its government. EQB has a role in planning, engagement, and reporting, and of course the authority to adopt rules to implement environmental review, and that piece is in 116D. So over here on the right is one way that we think about our work at EQB, that there are these three intersecting pieces. That interagency collaboration, that planning and reporting, environmental review, stewardship, and public engagement. So we see that coming out in these statutes already. Next slide. So if we put 116C and 116D together, we can organize them into this, these themes here. There's this broad vision, purpose, and goal statement that basically says that care for the environment is a state priority, and this is a big deal. And it's interesting to have that much information embedded in our statute about how people viewed the work of state government as it relates to the environment. And the people who wrote these laws really wanted to create some ways that we could make that happen, that we could have this productive and enjoyable harmony between human beings and the environment. And, the first bullet is consideration of environmental concerns and decision making, which is what happens in environmental review. Interagency collaboration that EQB is a big part of, that planning and reporting, long-term view. And then the role of the public in all of this that is really unique, I think, in MIPA. But that public debate, access to information, and the ability to seek review of projects as well. Next slide. So we may never get to the answer to some of these questions, and what really matters is what the board wants to do with this celebration. So the question here is, what is the opportunity represented by celebrating MIPA and EQB? What do we want to emphasize? So that's the conversation I'd like to have a little bit later, but first I'll run through some information that will inform that brainstorm. Next slide. So I've included some draft ideas that I've gathered from conversations about the intentions of this celebration project. Don't read all of this, it's way too much. They represent how different people have voiced the potential purpose of the celebration. I've summarized the themes of them over on the left-hand, in the left-hand column. So, celebrating successes of MIPA and EQB, taking a look back and looking at the history, raising awareness about where we are today, and then looking ahead to the future. So those are kind of the general themes that came out of these purpose statements for the project. I'm hoping that you can think about which ones resonate with you. It seems like, if we did all of these things, that would be a lot. So are there any pieces that you would get rid of? Is there anything here that is missing? Next slide. So as we go about planning this, we are considering a number of things. We'd really like to have your ideas on direction and scoping. We're really thinking about the capacity of EQB staff and also the potential contributions of member agencies and partners. We just want to point out that the celebration could be an independent standalone new activity in our work plan, or we could align it with existing activities such as these that are listed here. And this is not a comprehensive list of things on our work plan, but the Environment and Energy Report Card, the Environmental Congress, and the Climate Action Framework implementation and reporting. Next slide. So next steps in the project include continuing to develop a project charter with input from the board, colleagues and partners, establishing a steering team and an implementation team, and implementing the celebration in 2023. And that actually concludes the presentation. The next slide is discussion questions. So Madam Chair, when you're ready, we can move to those. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith, for that presentation and going through that and putting out ideas for us too to consider to get the juices flowing for some brainstorming on this. And so with that, I think we can go ahead and open it up for discussion for the board, from the board. And thank you for putting up these discussion questions. You know, and I don't think we necessarily have to go in order, but I do see which question, but I do see a hand up from Commissioner Stroman, so I'll go to you first.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Faith, thank you very much for that presentation. I think it was helpful to ground this discussion. And I'll just say, I just wanted to share a few thoughts, and I know that time is somewhat short here, and I'm curious to hear thoughts from colleagues as well. So in no particular order of the questions or specific to the questions, just a few thoughts. I think one of the things that strikes me is, you know, when we talk about the trajectory of environmental quality, you know, over a period of time or since NEPA, even though that's the name of this group, right? That's a very broad term, and you could look at that from a number of different factors. And of course, we measure many of those different environmental factors to try to understand how we're doing in terms of our environmental quality and in terms of the decisions we make. But I think it would be a mistake to sort of lay that all at the feet of NEPA and the Environmental Quality Board, because of course, while it is a very foundational, important piece, right, it's not the only piece. And obviously, there's a lot of contextual pieces that play in. And so I think to sort of measure like how were we doing 50 years ago and how are we doing today, I think might be a challenge just given all the other intervening factors. But what I do think is really interesting, and I think, you know, particularly from DNR perspective, has been the reflection of the values that our environmental resources and our just environment broadly is, you know, fundamentally important in the state of Minnesota. And, you know, I of course see this in my role all the time. Our outdoors and natural resources and nature are just fundamental to who we are across the state. And I think that NEPA really is unique. It is a unique tool that we have in the state of Minnesota to ensure that we can grow as a state, that we can prosper economically, that we can, you know, build out modern transportation systems and all of those things in a way that honors those environmental goals and values that we have. And so I think to be able to have something that just as bedrock is a place where that ensures that conversation happens, that agencies who are, you know, looking at projects, or in our case, we both review and propose projects, but that we can have those communication channels with developers, project proposers, local government officials, sister state agencies, and I think, Faith, as you pointed out, really importantly, the public, so that we can understand better the impacts or potential impacts that decisions we may be looking at or paths forward, so that we can make best decisions. I mean, to me, that seems like fundamentally Minnesotan, right? And, you know, we've all heard Governor Walz say Minnesota is like the problem-solving capital of the world. And I think in a way, this is very much in line with that, right? We've created a forum where people can come to the table and find find ways to move a project forward in a way that honors our environmental values. And so I think I would like to see some focus. I would advocate for some focus on that. And I think we have many examples of success over the years where we have come together in our different roles as Minnesotans to achieve all of the objectives. And then I think also there's a little bit of launch to the future, because I am not one who likes to only admire the past without some springboard to the future. But I think, again, pulling on that thread of the role of the public in this look at potential effects. And when you think about, some of the things that we see with heightened desires for public engagement, heightened expectations, I think, from the public for us to achieve multiple objectives. And you think about all of the new ways that technology has given us to communicate. And so what does taking that fundamental principle of, a conversation around these issues mean in a modern era? And I think that could be a really exciting question, and would love some conversation around that. So I'll stop talking and would love to hear thoughts of others.
Thank you, Commissioner Stroman. Great thoughts, and I love what you're highlighting there too, things to put a spotlight on where we've come in Minnesota. So, and I understand there is a comment in the chat from Sue Vento. So I can't see it, so I'm going to call on Erik to go ahead and read that.
Thank you, Chair Daubenberger. So Sue Vento had to leave already, but she had two suggestions regarding the 50th celebration. One, contact Peter Gove, Governor Anderson's environmental guru, who played a crucial role in the early days of EQB. And two, do what we can do to make the celebration a verb, encouraging Minnesotans to take action with special emphasis on connecting with K-12 and higher education students and faculty. Perhaps 4 seasons of taking steps to increase environmental quality. That's her comment. We also have a hand up here with Board Member Nelson.
Go ahead, Board Member Nelson.
Thank you, Board Member Nelson. I'll see if I can speak in the mic this time. A couple things. I tend to favor the broader definition than just the diving and staying close to just what NEPA was, and emphasizing success stories. If you could come out with some stories. People like to be on winning teams. So if we can make a story about success and where we've come in terms of outcomes in the resources, that would be good. That said, I do think we're at a changing point, and we should look really more to the future. And I don't know, I would like to ask staff a little bit if we can give some context in terms of who the audience is, who the participants are, how much time you have for this, and whether you have any budget. I think those would be important, because if it was me, I would really look into the second half of this, looking in the future, as maybe getting a futurist to come and talk about what's coming. Change is happening really, really fast. And it occurs to me that the NEPA process and what we had was about what we're building and how we're building it. And the future is going to be more about how are we going to live. We're going to change, if we need to change our shopping habits, farming practices, not so much what we're building. And a futurist might be able to get us into that, but it's not going to come.
Thank you, Member Nelson. Great. Not seeing any additional hands up, but I'm just wondering if there are any others in the room who have some thoughts they want to share.
Chair, this is Member Kohlasch. I had my hand up. I don't know if it came through or not.
Oh, I see it now. Thank you. Yes, it did.
And I don't want
Go
to preempt anybody else's comments, but also keep it brief. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Faith, for that presentation. Just very briefly, I guess one of the things that I would want to see as part of the emphasis in this discussion is some recognition that NEPA is more than procedural, that NEPA is more than simply a set of steps for conversations about things. NEPA encodes some substantive choices the legislature came right out and told us that no state action significantly infecting the quality of the environment shall be allowed unless where there are feasible and prudent alternatives. And the legislature went further and said, economic considerations alone shall not justify such conduct. That's right in the statute. And I think this discussion has to be informed by an acknowledgement of those substantive choices that the legislature made. And I think one way we can maybe frame that conversation is to simply ask whether the way that we have over the last 50 years construed and assembled the process of environmental review achieves those substantive goals, or whether there are opportunities for refinement and improvement. So I would be interested in including that in the discussion as appropriate. And I'll stop there because I'm sure there are other comments folks want to make.
Thank you, Member Conert-Steenberg. I am not seeing any, but and I just see a note here from Erik, no hands up in the room. And, you know, we can certainly give this additional thought and reach out to Faith with any further thoughts that we have on this. I heard a question in there maybe for Faith or for the EQB staff about sort of budget resources we have for this anniversary celebration, something we can certainly take back and give additional thought to how we could put some parameters around it too. But certainly like the thoughts that came up here today. You know, I know from MnDOT's standpoint, I'll just share that, you know, I've worked for the department for 23 years, and just even in that amount of time, I've seen such evolution of how we now weave environmental considerations and the importance of the environment into all that we do as we're moving projects forward. And it's definitely progressed and elevated and gone absolutely in the right direction. Still more work to do, of course, but I think about how changes have been made, how we now have technical experts in environmental areas in our staff that are so important as we're looking at our projects and our operations. So just things to think that we could highlight some changes over time too. With that, I'm going to do maybe a last call on thoughts from board members, if you have any today. So just watching for additional hands. And one last check with Erik. Nothing else in the room? No other hands raised in the room?
Not seeing any, Chair Daubenberger.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Faith. Thank you for that presentation. Thank you, board members, with some of the early thoughts that we have on this. We'll keep working on that, and we'll go to the next item on the agenda, the final item, which is the public comment. So we will follow the public comment procedures and guidelines provided on page 2 of the packet. So please raise your hand in WebEx if you would like to comment, and we'll call on those who signed up in person and those who have their hands raised in WebEx. And and I see now we have the public comment slide on the screen. Thank you for putting that up, Erik. And doesn't sound like there are any hands up, and I understand there, at least as of a little bit ago, there are no members of the public in the room in person. Okay, here, just confirm that. Okay, we'll just maybe pause here for a moment in case anyone jumps on. Also seeing a note that there are no written comments either. So we might not have any public comments today. And that's fine. I think maybe we could just move on then. and move to closing out the meeting. I'll just do one last call. Erik, anything else anything else you're seeing for hands in the room after the pause?
Madam Chair, no, we did have a question in the comment during the Clean Water Council water presentation, but I'll pass that on to Paul Gardner. And
Great. Thank you, Erik, for doing that, so we can get that answered. All right. So at this point, then, I'd just like to thank all the board members who participated today, those who came in person. Again, I wish I could have joined you in person today, but look forward to joining you in person in the near future. And with that, we've reached the end of the agenda, so I will ask for a motion to adjourn. Would anybody be willing to make a motion to that effect?
I will move to adjourn. This is Commissioner Arnold.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold. Is there a second?
I can second. This is Riley Hintz.
Thank you, Riley. All right. So all of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Not hearing any opposition to closing the meeting, so the motion carries and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you again, everyone. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.